All right, let's talk about how to actually run a gel using gel electrophoresis. You are going to want to make sure you have this written down on your gel electrophoresis worksheet. We are going over this together in class, but if you missed class for whatever reason or just need a quick recap, this video is going to be really helpful. So as we go, make sure you pause and you write down the information about these parts and label them on the diagram. And if you have questions about that, you can always rewind the video or ask about them when you come to class. So we're looking at the gel electrophoresis chamber right now. This is what's pictured on the diagram on your handout. It is a box that normally has inside of it a liquid that we call buffer. So if we look at the side view, you can see there's a gel already in there. And the buffer normally comes up just above the level of the gel. The buffer is a solution of salt. Salt is going to help it conduct electricity. We need to conduct electricity to move the DNA. So our first component here in the chamber is the liquid, which we call the buffer. The second thing is the power supply. So obviously we need electricity. If we follow these leads, we can see that they need to be plugged into something, and that something is the power supply. The power supply provides the electricity for this whole process. So let's take a look at what that power supply looks like. Move that chamber out of the way. This is the type of power supply we will be using. This power supply, you can set the voltage at whatever you want. You can pause and run the gel by pressing this button. And then these are the places where you plug in that chamber. You always match the color. So red is going to plug in to the red. And then we're going to have the black lead plugs into the black opening right here. Gonna make sure you get those lined up. Okay, and now that is ready to go. You can see that we actually have room for 3 more chambers here, and we'll probably have multiple chambers attached to this power supply during class. Okay, so back to our actual chamber. We're now going to look at these 2 electrodes. We have a black electrode and a red one. The black one is the negative electrode and the red one is the positive. This entire chamber is color-coded with black and red in several places. Obviously the lid here, these are the electrodes that are actually plugged into that power supply. If you slide the lid off, move that out of the way, you can see that on the chamber itself, there's a black dot on the negative electrode side and there's a red dot on the positive electrode side. So that's going to help us keep track of which side is which. And then inside this tray here, if I were to take this out, it also has a black side and a red side. So we always want to keep all of the black on one side and all of the red on the other. So let's talk about this agarose gel now that we have it out. The agarose gel is where you put the DNA. It is jello-like, so the DNA is able to pass through it, and you load the DNA in these little rectangular openings that we call wells, like a well that you would get water out of, but now you're loading DNA into the well. The well is going to hold the DNA right here until you turn on the electrical current, then the DNA is going to start to move. The way that you get a well in the agarose gel, I'm going to take this off. This is actually not a real agarose gel. It's just a practice gel made out of plastic. The real gel will be in this tray. So you have to tape the ends off. You're going to pour that gel into the tray while it's still liquid and molten. And then you use this device. This is called a comb, like a comb for your hair. But you're going to put it in the slots on the tray. And what that does, if we look at it from the side, we can see that it holds that plastic comb just above the bottom level of the tray. So it's going to hold it in place and make those regular indentations, which are going to become the wells of our gel. Once the gel has solidified, we can take the comb out, and then we can place this entire tray into our chamber, making sure that we always put the black stripe on the side with the black dot and the red stripe facing the red dot. So we put our gel in here. It's already filled with buffer. We know which electrode is which. And then we're going to slide that lid onto our chamber and turn on the electricity. So the other thing that you need to make sure you do on your diagram is indicate which way that DNA is going to move. So if we look at our practice gel, we're loading it here on the negative side. DNA has a negative charge, so that means it's being repelled by this electrode, but attracted by the positive electrode. So the DNA moves in this direction, from left to right in your diagram, and those small pieces are able to move much more easily, so they travel farther. The large pieces get stuck back at the beginning. So closer to the right side of your gel is where you're going to have those smaller pieces, and that is what you are labeling with the star on your diagram. So if you missed any of those parts and their functions, go ahead and rewatch that portion of the video. Make sure you have that written down. And if you have any questions about it, please make sure that you ask them in class. Next, we will talk about how to use a micropipette, which is the tool that you're going to use to load your gel. So let's learn how to properly use a micropipette. I have here an H20 micropipette, which can dispense between 2 and 20 microliters. So you never want to go below or above that stated range. Now, remember the parts of the micropipette that you're going to use are mostly going to be the plunger and this tip eject button and the volume adjustment knob. Here's our window. You can see that this is currently set at 100. So go ahead and remember how to interpret your volume. This is an H20. What volume is 100 on an H20 pipette? Go ahead and pause it if you need to think, and then you can play the video and see if you are right. If you said 10 microliters, you were correct. So we have this pipette set up to dispense 10 microliters of liquid. So what we're going to do is, first of all, make sure that we have a disposable tip on the end of the pipette here. The H20 pipettes use the tip in the yellow box, so we can open that up. You don't have to pick up the tip with your fingers. That's really messy. You get contamination all over those tips. All you have to do is use the pipette itself to get the tip. If you feel like it's not secure, you can give it a couple of taps. And when you take it out, that pipette tip is now securely attached. If I pull on it, I can see it's not going anywhere, so I know that that is a good attachment. Let's get these tips out of the way and talk about how you actually dispense liquid. First of all, you're going to hold the pipette in the palm of whatever hand you write with. Wrap your fingers around the barrel. Your finger should be up here against this guard. And then your thumb is going to rest on the plunger and can go very easily between the plunger and the tip eject button. So if I want 10 microliters of liquid, the way that I use this is I'm going to press the plunger down to the first stop. And by first stop, I mean it stops here. If I press harder, it will go farther. But that would be what we call the second stop. We just want the first stop. So when you get a pipette in your hand, always press that plunger. Make sure you can feel both stops. It's very easy to press to the first stop. It's harder to press to that second stop. So that's how you can tell the difference between the two. When I'm dispensing liquid and I want to measure something, I always have my tip out of the liquid to begin with. I press the plunger to the first stop only, and I hold it there. It should be very easy to hold the plunger at the first stop. And then whatever liquid I need, I'm going to grab a beaker that has just some water and food coloring in it so it's easier to see. I'm going to place the tip of my pipette into that liquid. So it needs to actually go into the liquid itself. Don't press it down so hard that it rests on the surface of the bottom of that beaker, because then it can create suction and mess up your volume. So just below the surface. And then to take up 10 microliters, I still have the plunger at the first stop. I'm going to very gently let that plunger come up to the top. Then after I've done that, I can take my pipette out of the liquid, and you can see here, because that liquid has a little color to it, there is my 10 microliters of liquid in the pipette tip. So if I want to now dispense that, I'm going to dispense it into this little tube here. This is a PCR tube. It's really small. And to dispense it, let me try to get this at an angle where you can see. I put the tip of the pipette in the tube where I want to dispense the liquid. And then I'm going to press down on that plunger. And as I do that, liquid is going to come out of the tip and into that tube. Now what I want to do is I can go all the way to that second stop. See that little bubble come out at the end? The purpose of that second stop is to blow just a little bit of air out to make sure that you don't have any liquid residue stuck in the tip. So now if we look at this tube, put the cap on, you can see that there is 10 microliters of liquid in that tube. So we have now accurately measured 10 microliters of liquid into this container. Now you'll notice when I was measuring here, again, I went to the first stop, then I placed the tip into my liquid, and then I slowly brought the plunger up. I did not do this. I didn't just let go. If you let go, you run the risk of sucking up bubbles into your tip, and then your volume is no longer accurate. So you want to make sure that you just slowly let that plunger come up. Don't ever just do that and let it snap back. So I've accurately measured my liquid. What do I need to do now? Well, I'm done with this tip. I need to dispose of it. So at your workstation, you're going to have some kind of waste container. That waste container is where you put your tip. So I'm going to hold the pipette over that waste container. There's my tip eject button. If I press it, it has now dispensed that tip into the waste container, and I can dump out all of those waste tips when I'm done with my lab. So those are the basics of using a micro pipette. Hopefully you found that to be helpful. The best thing you can do to learn to use a pipette is to practice in class. So please make sure that you do that. Don't just rely on watching a video to get the feel for how to use the pipette. There's really no substitute for holding it in your hand. So if you need to practice with a pipette, please just let me know and I will certainly help you out and get you that practice that you need. All right, now let's talk about the actual loading of the gel itself. You're going to need a micro pipette for this. It needs to be an H20 pipette because we're talking about only loading 10 to 20 microliters of sample. So remember how to properly use the micropipette. I'm not going to go through that again. You can rewind the video if you need to. The volume that you are measuring is going to be in this little tiny tube. And what you're going to do is I'm just going to take 10 microliters out of this tube here. See how my tip, I'm not all the way down at the bottom. I'm going to just hover over the bottom and suck up 10 microliters, excuse me. And then I'm going to put my tube down off to the side. Now I have my 20 microliters that I'm going to load into the gel. Now, super important is to not be shaky, right? You don't want your pipette tip shaking all over the place. So I always use a finger or two on the actual shaft of the pipette to help direct it and really stabilize that tip. So if I'm going to load into, let's say, this well right here, what I'm going to do is place the tip of my pipette just inside of the top of that well. I'm not jamming it all the way into the bottom. I'm not hovering over the top. I'm placing it just inside that tip of the well there. And then slowly press down on the plunger. You'll see liquid come out and it will go into that well. And then I'm going to take my pipette out before I release the plunger. You don't want to release the plunger while you still have your pipette tip in the gel, because then you're going to suck up all of the DNA that you just put into that gel. So again, what I'm going to do, you have your tube from the PCR reaction. You're going to press the plunger first to the first stop. Put the tip into your tube. Slowly release that plunger. You can see I've got liquid in there. Put the tube back down and then use your fingers to guide that just into the top of the well. Press down on the plunger until that liquid comes out. Don't really go to the second stop here. You don't want to blow a bubble into your gel. Just leave it at the first stop and then take your pipette tip completely out of the well, and only then can you release the plunger. So after all that, that's when I release the plunger. You don't want to blow bubbles into the well because you don't want to get your DNA splashing out of the well. And also you don't want to leave your tip in too long and release the plunger with the tip still inside, because then you suck all of that DNA right back up. This will take a little bit of practice, so you're not going to get this all from a video. Make sure you do practice this in class, but that's the basics of how you would load a gel. Our last step in the gel electrophoresis process is to stain the gel. When we take our gel out of the chamber, it looks very much like this. This is still that practice gel that we were looking at before, but notice how it's just clear. You can't see any bands of DNA because the DNA doesn't have any color on its own. So we soak it overnight in this blue stain. And the end result, I have a gel here that was stained by a previous class. So if you look at that on a white background, it's kind of hard to see on camera. In class, you can actually put a light behind it and you can see those bands of DNA are showing up in a dark blue. So you'll get to see that in a little bit better contrast when you look at your actual gel in class. But if I hold it up to the camera, you can kind of see those dark blue bands. That is the DNA in the gel. And we only see them because we soaked this overnight in a blue stain. So when you do your gel in class, you will get a gel in a bag just like this right here. You'll be able to look at it on a light box and you can see your bands of DNA. Now remember, how dark a band is just has to do with how much DNA is present in that location. It doesn't have anything to do with how big the fragment is, just how many of those fragments there are. So once you have your gel stained, you can actually see bands of different lengths. Remember, the short bands are going to travel farther. The longer bands are going to get stuck near the top. So using that information, go ahead and take a look at the end of your gel electrophoresis worksheet. You have some questions that have to do with DNA fingerprinting. Go ahead and see if you can answer those questions and check your work in class. Make sure you got the right answers. Hopefully you found this to be a helpful tour of some of our electrophoresis equipment, to include that pipette. And again, practice makes perfect, so make sure that you get some hands-on practice with this in class and don't rely on the video to be your only tutorial about how to use the equipment. Please let me know if you have any questions.